What's the creepiest urban legend folklore you've ever heard? I don't know that it classifies as creepy, but there was an urban myth in Australia back in the 1840s called the White Woman of Gippsland. The story goes that a ship wrecked itself on Australia's southeastern coast and a European lady who survived was taken prisoner by a local Aboriginal group. Word of this white woman being held by the savages got around and so horrified the relatively small population of white settlers that a posse was raised to set out in search of her. No such woman was ever found, but it did provide the Scottish settler Angus Macmillan and others of his ilk to commit numerous acts of genocide against the Aboriginal populations inhabiting the fertile agricultural and grazing lands. Not that he really needed an excuse, since he'd already been at it for years prior. Eventually a group of Aboriginals admitted they had a white woman in their possession and agreed to hand her back. She turned out to be a carved figurehead from a wrecked ship. I'm native, and the story of the stick people always gave me the heebie-jeebies at dusk, or if I was alone in the woods. It basically is that there are these stick people that live in the hills, and they draw children in who don't pay attention to their parents. Children, and even adults, who wandered into their territory. Children who are out past their bedtime. Or even babes out of their baskets when their mothers have their backs turned to put up laundry on the line. The stick people, as told to me, were small, midget-like, in size and skeletal. They were mischievous and wicked. They would steal from you, like the extra sock from your dryer, your lost car keys, or your children. As I lived in a very rural area on a reservation, I'd assumed these stick people lived up in the hills. So every time I'm in the hills now, I'm always looking around, and very alert. And not because there are bears and cougars in the area, but because of the stick people. In the northeast US, there's a story about woodspeople or man-o'-woods. When you're driving along a road in the woods and catch a glimpse of what looks like a person in the corner of your eye. But when you look directly at it, it's gone. They say you might have encountered a man-o'-woods. They are masters of camouflage and can sense when someone looks at them. They come to a halt so you can't sense any movement. It's speculated that they wear bark, mud, moss, and grasses to blend in. They're supposedly human, but extremely simple-minded. Barely verbal. They're very small in stature and avoid contact with civilization mostly. Nobody knows where they live or congregate, but they usually move on if there's too much activity around. They're also peaceful. Around some farmlands, they will do very simple chores at night or off in the distance. They may sweep a barn floor or stack some wood, but anything more complex is beyond them. They do it in exchange for not bothering them as they sleep in the barn for a night or for some bread and vegetables left out for them to find. They've never been known to steal or kill animals or livestock. This story relates to the Wendigo. A bunch of friends and I were out one night to do some urban exploring. Hiking through woods, etc. What else is there to do when you live in bumfuck nowhere? We were walking up a hill towards a connecting public park that was just kind of an open field with walking paths surrounded by dense woods. Standing on the edge of a tree line, we looked out into the open field and saw what we all thought was a deer. Not that strange. Deer are everywhere. We walk out into the field some more while watching the deer. As we get further out into the field, this deer stands up on two legs and covers about 100 yards in what seemed like only a few strides. This freaked us the fuck out and we left as fast as we could. I've been in the woods nearly all my life and I've never seen anything like that. Scary. A friend of mine from college had a project for his astronomy class and he needed to take progression pictures of a constellation over a course of a night. He went out to a field in the middle of nowhere and set up his camera on a timer next to his truck, where he slept that night. Next morning he's looking through his pictures and he sees a picture of the constellation. Picture of the constellation. Picture of him sleeping in his truck. Picture of the constellation. Picture of the constellation. Picture of him sleeping in his truck. Picture of the constellation. In San Antonio, there was a school bus which broke down on a set of train tracks. After getting stuck there, a train immediately barreled down the tracks, and before any of the children could get out of the bus, the train and bus collided and tragically killed all on board. It was such a tragedy that they eventually named all of the nearby streets after these children. So, as you drive past a mental institute on roads named after dead children, you come to a hill. On this hill is where the road meets the train tracks. You park on the tracks and put your car into neutral. For an added effect, you can put white powder on your bumper. Then, you wait. After a little bit, your car randomly starts moving by itself off of the tracks. It's even more odd, because your car doesn't go down the hill, but instead it goes up the hill. If you put white powder on your bumper, you go and look to find tiny fingerprints. Supposedly, those prints are proof of the reason why your car moved by itself off of the tracks. It's because the ghosts of the children who died in the wreck those years ago are what pushed you off of the tracks, to save your car and your life from being hit by a train like they were. Cloneman. I lived right outside Pittsburgh, PA as a teenager, in a little, poor town called Swissvale. The next communities over are Rankin and Braddock, which are steel production heyday ghost towns that have been plagued with poverty. A strip of woods, lined by a train track, follow the river upon which our communities reside. Right next to the river looms the decrepit abandoned steel mill I believe once called Carry Furnace. As teenagers do, my friends and I used to cut through the park, across the tracks, and to the river to drink, smoke pots, and hang out. Eventually, we started exploring the steel mill. I loved it. The graffiti and sculptural artists, the wildlife that randomly took over, the bums who made it home, etc. all made it a worthwhile adventure. I became comfortable there. Then my friends told me about an abduction and rape of a teenager whose naked and bloodied body ended up strung up on a set of city steps. The killer was an insane man who dressed as a clown with a horrid, blood-stained mask. He lives in the woods and in the steel mill. He walks the tracks with a butcher knife he hasn't even bothered to clean. Don't come here alone. I got into a fight with a boyfriend one night and stubbornly decided to walk alone from the river, across the tracks, and through the woods. I got to the tracks, turned and looked at the steel mill. Further down the tracks I saw a figure. I couldn't see a face, but the baggy pants were rather clown-like. I ran like you wouldn't fucking believe. I've never felt fear like that before. It was probably a bum. But who takes chances with an urban legend like that? So this happened with my grandpa who was in the military in 60s. It was back in the days when Pakistan and India were pretty much in a state of war. The famed 1965 Indo-PK war. His regiment was camping somewhere in the woods and every day all of them will be given some specific tasks to perform. As my grandpa says, his was to collect water or food from somewhere for the next morning and he would do it in the mid of night smoking as he loved the silence. One such night he's taking a stroll in the woods. Being an excursionist he just decides to take some other path to the well or whatsoever. My memory of this is somewhat distorted. So he's taking a walk there and he sees something crawling there. Pulling his gun out he takes hiding behind a tree only to realize it's a kid, baby goat. He decides to take the goat with him thinking that it's lost and will probably be eaten by wolves or some other wild animal. He carries the goat on his shoulder and getting back to the camps and after a while he feels like it's getting heavier and heavier but he shrugs it off wondering if it's just him getting tired but then there comes a point when his back is literally unable to carry the kid any longer and as he turns his head he sees that the kid's legs have grown longer and are almost touching the ground. In a rush he throws the goat and the goat starts laughing and screaming in human voice and jumping. It was fun. He runs back to the camp and spends the next day all in sickness and cold to the point he had to be moved to a medical area. When I was a kid I used to live with my family in Bucharest. One evening Dad was coming home from work. It was starting to get dark and the commute was at most 25-30 minutes. Anyway he waits at a light stop for a minute or two, with no car or people around. Which was a bit weird because the area was quite populated, especially at this hour. And in the blink of an eye when the light turned green, he was not in the city anymore. He said he was on an old road in the middle of a field with old black houses seen in the distance. And it was not almost dark anymore. It was pitch black dark with only the moon showing those creepy houses. He moved forward a 100 meters or so. And suddenly he was back at city. Like nothing changed. Just that now it was around 10 PM. The whole thing lasted 3 hours while for him it felt like seconds. He also didn't had any phone signal in that time. For years I thought he was lying. But every time he says this story I can see now he gets him a little unrested. In Alaska there was a myth that a guy would kidnap young women, take them to a cabin, rape them and then hunt them for sport. When my mom first moved to Alaska in the 70s she was a young teacher and most of her new friends attempted to scare her with stories like this and other stuff like random unexplained disappearances. Alaskans love to mess with lower 48ers heads when they are new to the state. Alaska is a huge state so people go missing all the time. There is always some rumor of a serial killer running amok. Well it turns out there actually was a man who would kidnap, rape, and murder young women during the 70s. He may also have hunted them for sport. His name was Robert Hansen. The man was terrifying. They even made a terrible John Cusack movie about it. So when I was in kindergarten, I lived in an old underground railroad house that one owner of the house apparently killed his autistic son in the 1930s. His ghost would turn on TV and go to random channels and every so often I'd wake up to a chill. Found out my room was his old room and that the TV was on the opposite wall from the secret room where he'd be sent if he misbehaved. Edit. At the time my dad was the treasurer of the school district and the building he worked in was haunted too. Apparently a child prodigy died tripping down the stairs there and every so often you could hear someone playing piano in the auditorium when there's no one there. Edit 2. One of my best friends a few years later lived next to the haunted fort in the same town and would hear drumming, marching and occasional distant musket shots. My grandmother died a month after I was born. So I never had the chance to know her but she supposedly had a sense of telling the future. Apparently for weeks she kept having dreams of my uncle approaching her and apologizing profusely. For no reason. He was in the military so she didn't get to see him often and assumed it was just her missing him. Then one night, she had a dream of a blue car flipping over multiple times and when she ran to the scene, my uncle was in the car and continued apologizing. The following morning, she got a phone call that my uncle and a few of his military friends died in a car accident. Turns out the car was also blue. In Kentucky's bluegrass region it is very hilly. This means that when fog develops, it pools into the areas between the hills and sort of flows along like a river. On one of the roads linking Fayette and Jessamine County, there is a bit of a valley where some houses can be found. Oftentimes there are reports of pale people in grey-white rags wandering in the mist whenever it forms there. I personally have not encountered it, but I have had several friends see it. Anytime people have tried to investigate or talk to them, they seem to disappear into the fog. It very well could just be locals wanting to have fun with the drivers. But it has become a peculiar story around here. It is said that many Cherokee and their horses were murdered in that area. In fact, a tobacco barn near there randomly burned down. And the photos of the incident showed that the flames bellowing into the sky were shaped like horses. Interesting stuff. My uncle was driving down a rural road in Maharashtra, which is a state in India. He was making a trip to this small piece of land that he owned for agricultural purposes, which was about 15 miles away from any form of civilization. As he was making the trip back to his hometown, he drove past this tiny shack in the middle of nowhere. A few miles from that shack he looks in his rear mirror and sees an old woman in a white sari in his back seat. There is blood running down the side of her face. At this point, my uncle is incredibly spooked. The lady reaches into the front seat and apparently tries to strangle him. He pulls over and gets out of his car. And there was no sign of her ever being in the back seat. When he finally reached home about an hour later, he had a fever of 107 and was in critical condition. After he came out of the ice bath, rested and woke up the next day, they found bruises on his neck. Apparently, the shack had been home to a serial rapist and killer who abducted women from the nearby village and killed them in there. The old woman and the car had been killed a few years ago. When I was a child I lived with my family in a small town in Thuringia, Germany. And there are some really old legends about gnomes. These are mostly nice stories where these little snents come one night in a month to help the people doing their work. They made dozens of shoes and baked hundreds of breads in just a few hours. There was some pack that was made hundreds of years ago. The gnomes do that but without being seen and they are free to take a share of the food they made. And if the people hear the gnomes work, they had to stay in bed. For a long time the people were fine with that. But at one day the major of a small village got greedy. He wanted to know how the gnomes did what they do. So he built a trap in a bakery, waited until the night went and captured one of them. He confronted the other gnomes and told them he would only release the captured gnome if they tell him his secret. And they did. So the next day the major was found in his house. It was filled up with breads and cakes he made. Hundreds of brand new shoes, shirts and trousers were laying around and blood everywhere. The major's hands, arms and legs were broken, burned and cut open. His clothes was hanging from his body in slit up pieces. When some of the people tried to speak to him he was just laughing like a madman and told them he was working so hard. The gnomes never showed up again. From time to time there are reports of people who saw gnomes in caves or the forests of Thuringia. I'm late to the party but here goes. So the deal is, I come from a small town in Iceland Sea, a 200 km from the capital, Reykjavik. The town is called VK and on each side of the town there are vast black sands which the main roads led through. The only way in and the only way out of town is through the sands. The black sands stretch from the sea up to the mountains. Around 1800-1900 a coastline was a popular fishing spot for French fishermen where they would fish for mainly codfish. There's estimated that around 400 of the boats that fished along the coast ended up stranding. Some of the stranded fishermen made it alive. Most did not. So a lot of men have died down there through the ages. As well as bypassers that got lost in fog or died from the cold unexpected storms that can occur seemingly out of nowhere during the winter. There are shallow valleys crosswise after water streams from the glacier that passed down there a long time ago. Most of them have dried up since. There is this one particular valley called Draugali, Ghost Valley. In the winter time we only get a few hours of sunlight during the day which means the nights are long and cold. I have heard from many sources that drove by there that when they passed through the valley alone, unwanted hitchhikers tend to appear out of thin air in the seats alongside them. They don't say anything and just stare straight ahead and then when they pass over the valley on the other side they disappear. I used to drive there every weekend for 4 years and luckily never witnessed this. I'm not the one to be spooked out by urban legends but this one always got to me. Driving alone in the middle of nowhere. Going down the valley I would usually catch myself way over the speed limit when I came up the other side. Just in case. In my country when you get lost people say something that I'll roughly translate as being seized by lead around. What's this lead around? Oh. Nothing much. Just something that makes you walk around in circles. Except there are also stories of people who met some innocent creature like a child or a dog and followed it. Got tired. Sat down to rest and woke up next morning just to find themselves a step from falling into water. Seems slightly suspicious. Right? Well, I googled it. Turns out its main goal is drowning unsuspecting travelers. It gets people mentally confused. So that they start doing weird pointless things. Lose ability to tell where they are and don't see around them. Which enables it to lure them to water. It is said that it is destiny for some people to drown. Lead around knows this and will try particularly hard to point that it may get violent. If it's already close to its goal. TLDR. If you get lost, it's because an invisible demon, capable of shape-shifting and influencing your senses, is trying to drown you. Jay's journal is a true story that happened where I grew up. Only mildly creepy though. Some depressed kid was dabbling in witchcraft or some shit like that and he wrote a journal about his feelings and experiences before he ended up committing suicide. An author took his journal and made a book out of it. His family claims that the book only used about 12 pages out of 100 plus of his real journal. And that she took a lot of liberties in her book. so I doubt it's as supernatural as people make it out to be. But the town he was from is full of fucked up stories and is said to be cursed. And I wouldn't doubt it. Okay. So I used to go visit my grandma in Indiana a lot when I was younger. They have a lot of folklore up there about ghosts and whatnot. And I usually laugh that stuff off. But there's this one story about the Dogface Bridge. Basically, this couple was on their honeymoon and crossing a bridge in their car when a dog dashed into the road. They swerved to avoid it, but couldn't, and they all ended up falling into the river together. The police recovered the husband's body, but only found the head of the wife and the body of the dog. And now there's a legend. If you go to the Dogface Bridge and park your car and wait, you can see a figure with the body of a woman and the head of a dog, who will scratch at your windows and whine to be let in. It wouldn't affect me as much. But the night I read this story there was a big storm and my grandparents' dog was whining and scratching at the back door all night. It really frightened me. Kelpies. Those fuckers looks like a pretty horse or a bangin' hot lady. And sometimes a seal depending on who you ask. You touch them, either by accident, them tricking you or hugging you, your flesh binds to theirs. And the only way to escape is to cut off your limb or it's slim and get a surgeon later. If they bind you good, they walk into the water, wrapping you in them, drown you, and consume your drowned body through their skin. We should sell more cuddly soft kelpies and plastic wind up kelpies etc in tourist hat shops. The Irish make a fuckton of money out of leprechauns. We should totally cash in on kelpies. It should be a bigger part of the marketing. 2. Goes well with the Nessie Tours theme. If you like the invisible non-existent massive dinosaur sea monster, you'll love these mad killer seahorse beasties. That kind of thing. On the other hand, which tourist in their right mind is really going to go to Falkirk? No disrespect for Falkirk, but it's hardly Loch Ness. Waco. TX. Outside Cameron Park. Off in the woods, there lie the ruins of a castle. The witch's castle. The story goes that back in the 1800s she used to sacrifice children, black servants, people's pets, all sorts of things. She performed black magic and any number of things you can think of associated with witchcraft. Finally, the townspeople had enough of the old witch and revolted. They marched into the woods to her castle, locked her inside and burned and tore down the castle while she was still inside. She died cursing the people and their families and all of Waco. It used to be open to the public when my grandparents were young, but now it's been closed off and separated from Cameron Park. However, there are hidden ways to still get to it. Now when you go, the entrance gate has a creepy graffiti clown on it and most people stop there because it's pitch black and too spooky. If you keep going down the wooded trail you'll make it to the ruins. I've been and I've pissed all over it. Nothing bad has happened to me because of it, I think. As a side note, one time me and some buddies went and there is an old dead and decaying tree by the clown gate entrance. Well, someone thought it would be a good idea to literally hang, with fishing line, apples upon apples on each of the dead tree limbs. A friend of mine's hometown has a length of road through some hills that winds around with 13 curves, referred to as the 13 curves. Legend has it that near or on Halloween a couple who recently married sometime in the late 50s early 60s got into a car accident navigating the road. Now on Halloween if you drive the road at midnight, the bride, bloodied and glowing, appears before your car trying to get you to crash. The story changes by region, but having driven on the road on Halloween there is definitely a creepiness to it. Also the road is very dangerous to drive at night. Some turns are so sharp if you don't slow down to 10 miles per hour you could easily lose control. In a quiet rural area in upstate New York, a string of murders appeared that nobody was able to solve. Victims would be found dead in places where they appeared to be spending moments prior to their death relaxing, unaware that their demise was moments away. A young woman was staying in her mother's summer home one night when she decided to lay down on her couch to watch TV before bed. She begins to doze off, but opens her eyes to see the face of a man staring at her from right outside her window. She screams and immediately calls 911. Police arrive in a matter of minutes to locate the suspect but are puzzled. The window that the woman saw the man in was overlooking a lake with an artificial sandy shore. But no footprints were located. A few days later, the victim is apprehended and interrogated. Tied to at least a dozen murders. Detectives figure out that the man is a serial killer who kills victims in their sleep. They ask him about the attempted murder from a few nights back on the young woman and how he got away. Already being tied to the other murders. He confesses that he wasn't outside of her house. What the young woman saw that night was not the man outside her window, but rather the reflection of his face, as he stood behind the couch and waited for the young woman to fall asleep.